Hey guys, tonight we step into a world that's both grim and strangely mesmerizing medieval Europe, where justice wasn't just a matter of law, but a public spectacle designed to test patience, endurance, and sometimes just plain humiliation. Imagine yourself trudging through muddy streets, the stench of open sewers mixing with the chatter of the crowd, and every misstep you made could land you center stage for the town's latest cruel entertainment. You probably won't survive this without learning a lesson in patience, or maybe a good story to bore your friends to sleep. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? It's kind of fun knowing who's listening right now, maybe even picturing you all tucked in around the globe. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The roots of medieval justice are darker and more theatrical than your usual courtroom drama. Back then, law was less about written statutes and more about public ritual. Townsfolk craved the drama, and punishments were designed not just to hurt, but to humiliate and control through spectacle. You're not just a defendant. You're a player in a macabre play with the entire village as your audience. Public punishments served a dual purpose, deterring others and reaffirming social order, though often they only fed the crowd's appetite for misery. Legal systems varied wildly across Europe, but many shared a reliance on physical penalties that tested your fortitude. You might think the Middle Ages were just a blur of random cruelty, but historians still argue whether these punishments were meant more as deterrents or as actual reform tools. The line between justice and entertainment was blurry, and sometimes it felt like the crowd was the real judge. In medieval towns, justice was meted out in squares or marketplaces, the very heart of communal life. You'd be dragged in front of your neighbors, forced to endure whatever sentence awaited, often under the hot sun or driving rain. This was no quiet legal proceeding. Your shame was a spectacle, and patience became as valuable as innocence. The idea was simple. You learn from suffering in public. Your patience is a form of penance, and your endurance a lesson to others. But it wasn't just the physical pain that defined medieval justice, it was the slow, grinding nature of it all. Imagine standing hours, sometimes days, locked in wooden frames or cages, enduring jeers, rotten vegetables, and the stink of the crowd. Patience wasn't just a virtue, it was a survival skill, and that's where our journey begins. With a legal world that's harsh, noisy, and strangely captivating, you find yourself locked in a wooden frame, arms and head held fast, exposed to the bustling marketplace's judgmental eyes. The stocks and pillories were medieval justice's preferred tools of public humiliation, a punishment that went far beyond mere physical pain. It's a test of your patience and your ability to endure not just the discomfort of being immobilized, but the jeers, laughter, and flying rotten produce hurled your way. The sun beats down on your face, the smell of spoiled fruit mixing with sweat and unwashed bodies. Your reputation crumbles with each passing hour, as neighbors who once greeted you warmly now mock your misfortune. Stocks, those simple contraptions locking your feet or hands, were common throughout Europe, especially in England. They immobilized offenders, forcing them to sit or stand exposed in the village square. Nearby stood the pillory, a more humiliating cousin that secured your head and hands, elevating your suffering to full view of the crowd. While historians agree these punishments were meant to shame offenders publicly, they still argue whether the primary goal was retribution or social control through communal participation. What's fascinating is how these devices became stages for a strange social dynamic. Townspeople didn't just observe, they actively participated, throwing rotten eggs, mud, or even worse, insults, became part of the ritual. It's like being a live target for a very unpleasant carnival game. You might think that these punishments were purely about physical pain, but really, they were about turning the offender into a public spectacle of vulnerability. Imagine the quiet patience you'd have to summon, knowing any moment could bring a rotten tomato or a stinging insult. Sometimes the pillory served a dual purpose, functioning as both punishment and marketplace entertainment. the more notorious your crime. The bigger the crowd, the louder the laughter, and the harsher the treatment. You might catch a glimpse of someone chuckling a little too hard or spitting in your direction. It's no wonder that being put in the stocks or pillory was often feared more than corporal punishment. Your body may not be hurt much physically, but your pride and sanity, those are the true casualties. One quirky detail, in some places, officials would pour honey or molasses on pilloried offenders to attract flies and wasps, adding an extra layer of slow, buzzing torment. So, patience here meant enduring physical discomfort, social ridicule, and the incessant buzzing of nature's less friendly creatures. It's like a medieval mosquito trap designed just for you, of course. Whether this was common practice or occasional cruelty is still debated among scholars. Some say it was exaggerated by later writers eager to paint medieval punishments as excessively barbaric. If you ever wonder whether there was any mercy, consider the fact that sometimes passers-by could offer small tokens, coins, or food to lessen the punishment or speed up release. That introduces a complicated interplay between justice and charity, showing the punishment was not always a rigid sentence, but sometimes a public negotiation. This nuance challenges our modern black and white view of medieval law and punishment. And remember, stocks and pillories didn't only punish criminals. They were used for all sorts of offenses, ranging from petty theft to being an annoying town gossip. Yes, the pillory was the original cancel culture in full public display, only much messier. You had to wait, stand or sit quietly, and survive the collective scorn of your community until your sentence ended or someone's pity intervened. So, as you imagine the rough wood biting into your wrists and ankles, the sun burning your neck, and the crowd's relentless jeers, it becomes clear this punishment is less about swift justice and more about slow endurance. The real crime, running out of patience. The cracking sound of the whip slicing through the air echoes sharply, and you flinch before the first strike lands across your back. The whipping post isn't just a physical punishment. It's a public lesson in endurance. A ritualized display meant to break both body and spirit, while testing your ability to withstand pain and shame. You're bound tightly to a post, stripped to expose your flesh. As a crowd gathers around, some eager for justice, others just hungry for spectacle, the scent of sweat and fear mixes with the stinging air. Whipping was one of the most common punishments across medieval Europe, used for crimes ranging from theft to blasphemy. The post itself was often a stout wooden pillar erected in the town square, a stark symbol of authority and suffering. The person administering the whip was sometimes a professional executioner or a local official, wielding a scourge or a multi-tailed whip designed to tear flesh, or at least leave long-lasting welts. But the act wasn't merely about inflicting pain. It was a performance intended to instill obedience and fear. Historians still argue whether whipping was truly meant to reform offenders or simply to satisfy the crowd's thirst for punishment. Was it a merciful alternative to harsher sentences, or a brutal display to reinforce social hierarchy? The truth probably lies somewhere in between. What's clear is that whipping was designed as a test of patience, a forced endurance where you had no choice but to absorb pain publicly and silently. One quirky tidbit: in some towns, the whipping post was adorned with bells, which rang out with each strike to announce the offender's torment to the entire community. The sound was a grim reminder that no crime was hidden from public scrutiny, and that punishment was a communal affair. The bells added an almost ritualistic element, turning punishment into a noisy spectacle. Imagine the jarring clang of metal echoing as the whip cracked hard, to ignore and impossible to forget. The crowd's reaction was a mixed bag. Some spectators showed sympathy, especially for minor offenders, while others jeered and encouraged the lash. This unpredictable atmosphere made whipping a psychologically taxing ordeal, where your patience was as much tested by the crowd's mood as by the whip itself. Imagine standing there, muscles tense, waiting for the next strike, knowing the crowd's cheers or boos could rise or fall in an instant. Pain aside, whipping left physical marks that could carry social consequences long after the punishment ended. a scarred back was a visible stigma, a reminder of your crime and your community's judgment. Some people managed to endure the lashes without much visible injury, but many bore permanent wounds that marked them for life. Interestingly, some offenders even saw whipping as a path to redemption. Enduring the pain was a way to cleanse their sins. Whether that was true or just hopeful thinking remains a topic historians debate. You might think that whipping was a quick punishment, but in reality, it could last for many lashes, sometimes until the victim collapsed or was otherwise incapacitated. The length and severity depended on the crime, local laws, and the officials' discretion. Wading through it all, counting each lash, became a grim exercise in patience and mental fortitude. So, as the whip cracks again and the bells toll, you realize this punishment is as much about teaching you to endure the crowd's judgment as it is about your own physical suffering. It's a slow, loud lesson that echoes through medieval towns, reminding everyone that patience and pain walk hand in hand in the pursuit of justice. You stand trembling at the edge of the pond, the chill of the water brushing your ankles, as the crowd watches with hungry eyes. The ducking stool awaits a strange contraption designed to test not only your body, but your ability to endure humiliation. The idea is simple, yet cruel. You're strapped to a chair attached to a long lever, then repeatedly plunged into icy water. The cold shock, a sharp contrast to the burning shame of public exposure. The laughter and jeers echo as you struggle to hold your breath and keep your composure. Ducking stools were mostly used for punishing women accused of being scolds, nags, or sometimes witches. The punishment was meant to silence disruptive voices, literally dunking troublemakers into the water to cool their tongues. The chair's repeated dips forced you to balance the physical shock of cold water and the mental strain of social degradation. It wasn't quick, and it wasn't painless. Instead, it was a prolonged, slow test of patience and endurance. Historians still debate whether the ducking stool's primary function was punitive or a method of informal trial by water, a crude attempt to determine guilt by whether you sank or floated. The sinking often meant innocence, but also meant drowning. So this test was deadly serious. Others argue it was purely a tool of social control, meant to keep women in line by making a public example of them. One particularly peculiar detail is how communities sometimes added variations. In some places, the stool was rigged to allow a slow rise and fall into the water, prolonging the ordeal to maximize discomfort and shame. In others, the water was mixed with mud or other unpleasant substances to add a stinging element to the punishment. The experience wasn't just about the cold. It was a full sensory assault, combining physical pain, humiliation, and fear. The psychological impact was immense. Imagine being dunked repeatedly, your lungs burning for air, the cold water numbing your skin, while the crowd watches and jeers. It's not just about surviving the physical punishment. It's about enduring the social consequences of being marked a troublemaker. You have to summon patience, not only to survive the water, but to face the judgment that awaits you afterward. Interestingly, the ducking stool punishment wasn't always permanent. In some towns, surviving the ordeal without serious injury meant you were cleansed of your offense. In others, it was just the beginning of a longer sentence or a prelude to more severe punishment. The line between justice and cruelty was thin and often blurred. So, as you brace yourself for another plunge into the cold, remember that this punishment is less about quick justice and more about slow, relentless endurance. The ducking stool is a chilling reminder that patience in medieval times wasn't just a virtue, it was sometimes a matter of life and death. You bear the scorching brand, a searing symbol of your crime burned directly into your flesh, a mark that won't fade with time. Branding and maiming weren't just brutal punishments. They were permanent lessons designed to ensure you carried your guilt visibly, a walking reminder to yourself and the world. The fiery iron pressed against your skin was not only a test of pain tolerance, but a punishment meant to enforce social control by making sure everyone knew your crime at a glance. Branding was widespread throughout medieval Europe, often used for theft, desertion, or repeated offenses. The process varied by region. Sometimes the mark was placed on the hand, sometimes the cheek or forehead. The image or letter branded was usually an initial or symbol representing the crime. Like a T for thief, unlike whipping or stocks, branding left no room for forgetting. The mark was as public and permanent as your punishment. Historians still argue about the long-term social consequences of branding and maiming. Was it meant to rehabilitate by deterring further crimes, or did it simply condemn offenders to lifelong ostracism? Some argue that branded criminals found it nearly impossible to reintegrate into society. Their marks a form of social death, even if their bodies survive. One intriguing detail: in some places, the iron used for branding was heated to different temperatures depending on the crime's severity. A light brand might leave a scar, while a hot brand burned deeper, causing lasting damage and intense pain. You can imagine the nerve-wracking wait before the iron touched your skin. The anticipation almost worse than the actual burn. Maiming, cutting off ears, noses, or fingers served a similar purpose, a harsh, visible punishment that was impossible to ignore. Unlike branding, maiming altered your body permanently in ways that affected daily life. Losing a finger could mean losing your livelihood, and a missing ear marked you as a social outcast. Some argue maiming was a more severe punishment than death in some cases, as it condemned you to a life of hardship and stigma. A quirky and rather gruesome fact is that some criminals were branded not just once, but multiple times in different places on their bodies. This multi-branding was meant to reinforce their identity as outlaws or repeat offenders. It's like medieval tattooing, but with much more painful and unwanted designs. The psychological weight of bearing a brand or maim was enormous. Every glance in a mirror, every social interaction reminded you of your past mistake. Patience here wasn't about waiting for the punishment to end. It was about living with the consequences indefinitely. Imagine the kind of slow, simmering endurance required to face that daily reminder. So, as the heat of the branding iron sears into your skin, remember, this punishment was more than physical. It was a lifelong sentence written on your body, teaching patience in a way no whip or pillory could match. You remain locked in the pillory, head and hands secured in the unforgiving wood, while the world around you doesn't just watch, it adds its own brand of torment. It's not just the villagers' jeers or the occasional rotten vegetable flying your way. Nature itself conspires against you. Flies swarm around your sweaty face, buzzing relentlessly, while birds perch nearby, sometimes leaving unwelcome gifts. This natural harassment turns your punishment into a sensory nightmare, where patience means enduring not just human scorn, but also the constant, irritating presence of tiny, buzzing adversaries. The pillory was a staple of medieval punishment, designed primarily for public humiliation. Unlike the stocks, which restrained the feet, the pillory immobilized your head and hands, making you utterly helpless. But what historians find particularly fascinating is how the punishment's effectiveness was amplified by nature itself. The idea that the elements and wildlife played a role in medieval justice is a quirky, yet very real aspect often overlooked in history books. Historians still argue whether this natural torment was intentionally used by officials or simply an accidental side effect of the pillory's outdoor placement. Some suggest that placing offenders outside, exposed to sun and wind, was a deliberate choice to add discomfort. Others believe the added misery from insects and birds was an unintended consequence. But either way, it compounded the punishment's psychological impact. In fact, medieval towns were notoriously unclean by modern standards, with open sewers, livestock wandering freely, and trash piling up near marketplaces. This meant the pillory's occupants were not only subject to verbal abuse, but also to a mix of foul smells and pests. Flies were especially attracted to sweat and exposed skin, making it nearly impossible to find relief. Imagine the frustration of swatting at buzzing flies while trying not to move and risk aggravating your restraints. Adding to the misery, birds like pigeons and crows often took advantage of the helplessness of the pilloried. Reports tell of bombing runs where birds would defecate on the punished, further humiliating them This wasn't just symbolic bird droppings could sting and irritate the skin, adding a physical element to the punishment. The natural world, indifferent and harsh, became an accomplice to human cruelty. One quirky note: some towns tried to discourage this by covering the pillory with a partial roof or canopy. But these were rare. The exposure to sun, rain, and pests was often left intentionally to prolong discomfort. This led to the term pilloried in the elements, emphasizing the punishment's environmental harshness. Patience here required more than just enduring social humiliation. It meant surviving a multisensory assault that tested your mental and physical limits. You had to sit still, sweat, itch, swat, and swallow insults all at once. It's the kind of slow, nagging torture that gets under your skin, literally and figuratively. So as you sit locked in that pillory, remember, medieval punishments weren't just about the law or the people they enlisted, nature's harshest accomplices, to make sure you learned your lesson, one fly buzz at a time. You hear the creak of iron doors and the cold clang of metal, and a chill runs down your spine, not from the damp dungeon walls, but from the fearsome legend of the Iron Maiden. The story of this terrifying torture device, a coffin lined with spikes that slowly impaled the victim, is one of the most haunting images of medieval cruelty. Yet historians still argue whether the Iron Maiden was a genuine medieval instrument of torture or a later invention fueled by sensationalist tales. Regardless, the idea alone sends shivers down your spine, tapping into the darkest corners of human imagination. The Iron Maiden is often depicted as a tall, human-shaped iron cabinet with spikes positioned inside, designed to close around a person, piercing but not immediately killing them. The slow agony was meant to extract confessions or punish the worst criminals. However, solid evidence of its actual use in medieval Europe is sparse, and many experts believe it was either a myth or a 19th century invention popularized by sensational exhibitions and pamphlets. Historians debate the origins of the Iron Maiden. Some trace it to early mechanical devices used in torture, while others see it as a product of later fear-mongering about medieval brutality. The lack of reliable contemporary sources from the Middle Ages mentioning the device adds to the mystery. Was it real, or was it medieval horror fiction? The answer remains elusive, keeping the Iron Maiden suspended somewhere between fact and legend. One quirky tidbit: several surviving Iron Maiden replicas date from the 18th or 19th centuries and were likely created for museums or curiosity collections rather than actual use. Some even show design flaws that would have made them impractical for torture, suggesting they were crafted more for shock value than function. Despite the uncertainty, the Iron Maiden captures a chilling cultural imagination. It represents the ultimate test of patience and fear, being trapped in an unyielding metal shell with sharp spikes inches from your skin. The mental torture of awaiting the closing of the door, combined with the slow physical agony, embodies the darkest side of punishment. What is clear is that the medieval period was full of brutal devices, many real, some imagined, all designed to assert control through fear and endurance. Whether or not the Iron Maiden was ever truly used, its legend still teaches a lesson about the human capacity to create stories of horror to enforce social order. So, as the heavy metal door swings closed in your mind's eye, remember that sometimes the most terrifying punishments exist as much in story and fear as in flesh and blood. You dangle from the gibbet, the rough rope biting into your wrists and neck, the cold wind whipping your exposed skin. The cage enclosing your body sways gently with each gust, your feet barely touching the ground, or maybe not at all. This isn't a quick execution, it's a slow, public spectacle of suffering, a punishment designed to hang you in plain sight long after death, or to torment you alive with exposure to the elements. The gibbet and cage punish not just your body, but your patience, forcing you to wait in suspended agony as townsfolk pass below. The gibbet, a metal cage hung from a gallows, was a particularly gruesome form of punishment, used primarily in England and parts of continental Europe. It was often reserved for murderers or highwaymen offenders deemed especially dangerous or contemptible. Instead of burying the body, authorities would hang the corpse, or sometimes the living offender, in a cage, leaving it to rot or suffer in full view. This was meant as a stark warning to others. Crime led to public disgrace and a slow death. Historians still argue about how often the gibbet was used on living prisoners versus the dead, and whether it was primarily symbolic or an actual prolonged form of torture. Some sources suggest that in rare cases, offenders were left to die slowly in their cages, while others say it was mostly post-mortem display. Either way, the slow passage of time was central. The punishment forced patience in a literal, suspended state. One curious fact is that some gibbets were specially designed to allow airflow and prevent quick death, prolonging the victim's suffering. The cages were sometimes ornately wrought iron, making the punishment as much about spectacle as function. Imagine the mental torment of watching the sky change and feeling every weather shift as your body hangs exposed. The gibbet also introduced a darker side of medieval justice, the mingling of human punishment with scavengers and nature. Birds, rats, and insects feasted on the corpse or the living prisoner, adding a layer of slow decay and discomfort. This natural participation in the punishment made patience a grim endurance of not only time, but also of slow bodily dissolution. Public reaction varied from morbid curiosity to revulsion. Some viewed the gibbet as justice served, others as a cruel, degrading display. The uncertainty about its ethical standing continues in historical debates. Was it a necessary deterrent or a barbaric spectacle? The answer is complicated, reflecting the period's conflicted views on punishment. So, as you hang there in the cage, exposed to the elements and the gaze of a judgmental crowd, remember that this punishment wasn't just about death. It was about making you wait, suffer, and endure the slow passage of time in the harshest way possible. You sit bound, a cold, metal muzzle clamped tightly around your head, preventing your voice from rising above a muffled whimper. The scold's bridle, sometimes called a brank, is a medieval invention designed to silence women accused of being nagging, gossiping, or otherwise disturbing the peace. This iron contraption clamps over the head with a spiked plate pressing down on the tongue, making speech impossible without severe pain. Its punishment and control wrapped into one cruel device, testing your patience not only physically, but mentally, as you endure enforced silence while the world judges you. The scold's bridle was mostly used in England and parts of Northern Europe from the 16th century onward, especially on women who defied social norms by speaking out too much or behaving improperly. Its use highlights the gendered nature of medieval justice, where punishment often aimed to maintain social order by controlling women's voices. The device was a harsh reminder that in a male-dominated society, patience sometimes meant forced silence. Historians still argue about the frequency of the scold's bridle's use, and whether it was primarily a tool of punishment or a method of public humiliation. Some believe it was more common than records suggest, while others think it was reserved for extreme cases, reflecting broader debates about gender and authority in medieval times. One quirky fact: the scold's bridle sometimes featured a bell attached to the headpiece, which rang loudly whenever the wearer moved their head. This bell alerted the community not only to the wearer's offense, but also ensured their humiliation was constant and public. Imagine the combination of muffled silence and jangling bells, an unwanted soundtrack to your slow endurance. The psychological torment was intense. Being unable to speak while everyone watched and whispered about you forced a type of patience that went beyond physical pain. It was a punishment of invisibility and voicelessness, stripping you of agency in the most fundamental way. Silence became both a sentence and a symbol. The scold's bridle also raises questions about justice and gender bias. Was this device a necessary tool to maintain order, or a misogynistic method of oppression? Modern scholars debate how much it reflected societal fears of outspoken women versus genuine concerns about public disorder. So, as you sit there, your tongue stinging under the iron spikes, the bells ringing with every twitch, remember that medieval punishments often enforced patience through silence, especially for those who dared to speak up when they shouldn't. The wooden frame creaks under your weight as you sit in the pillory once more. But this time, something's different. Over the centuries, This familiar device begins to shift roles from harsh instrument of humiliation to a form of public safety and legal pragmatism. The pillory's evolution reflects changing attitudes about punishment, patience, and the balance between justice and mercy. You watch as townsfolk still gather, but the mood softens, hinting at a new understanding of what it means to endure consequences in public. Originally, the pillory was designed for maximum shame and discomfort, locking your head and hands, leaving you vulnerable to the crowd's scorn and physical abuse. But by the late medieval period, its use began to evolve. In some places, the pillory became a place not just of punishment, but of protection. For example, it was sometimes used to hold witnesses or accused persons temporarily during trials, keeping them visible yet safe from violent mobs. This shift hints at a society grappling with the harshness of its own justice system. Historians still debate whether this evolution was driven by humanitarian concerns or practical necessity. Was society growing more compassionate or simply more organized? Some argue the change reflected a growing legal sophistication, where public punishment served more as a social tool than as pure cruelty. Others see it as a response to abuses and public backlash against excessive harshness. A quirky detail: in certain towns, the pillory was fitted with padded restraints or even roofs to protect occupants from weather and the worst of the crowd's attacks. These modifications suggest a surprising degree of concern for the punished enough to encourage patience by offering some small relief amid the ordeal. Moreover, the pillory's role in social control remained strong, but the method shifted from brutal public spectacle to more regulated, timed exposures. Offenders might be confined for hours rather than days, balancing the community's need for justice with emerging ideas about dignity and fairness. This gradual softening shows that patience in punishment became less about endless suffering and more about measured endurance. Interestingly, some offenders use their time in the pillory to speak to the crowd, sometimes begging for mercy or explaining their actions, turning punishment into a stage for social negotiation. This was a subtle but important way patience and endurance intersected with the human need for voice and agency. So, as you sit in the pillory's evolving embrace, remember that even medieval punishments were not static. They changed with society's shifting ideas about justice, cruelty, and the endurance required to survive both. You shuffle forward, coins heavy in your purse, because sometimes medieval justice preferred jingling money over cracking whips or wooden restraints. Fines were a surprisingly common way to resolve crimes, turning punishment into a financial transaction that tested patience differently through the slow burn of economic strain and social shame. Instead of enduring pain or humiliation in the stocks, you might be ordered to cough up a sum that could burden you and your family for weeks or months, shifting the punishment from body to wallet. Fines were used throughout medieval Europe for a range of offenses, from minor infractions like damaging property to serious crimes like assault. The amounts varied widely depending on the offender's status and the nature of the offense. Wealthier individuals could often pay their way out of harsher punishments, while poorer folks faced a cruel dilemma: pay what they could barely afford or suffer harsher penalties. This system raised obvious questions about fairness and justice. Historians still argue about how equitable fines were as a form of punishment. Did they reinforce social inequalities by favoring the rich? Or were they practical tools to avoid overcrowding in prisons and reduce violent reprisals? The debate continues, especially given the patchwork nature of medieval law, where local customs greatly influenced outcomes. One quirky fact: in some cases, fines could be paid through labor or goods instead of coin. Offenders might be required to provide livestock, crops, or days of work to the victim or the lord of the manor. This barter system turned punishment into a drawn-out process of economic survival, forcing patience through financial hardship rather than physical pain. The slow process of raising the money often meant families had to tighten belts, sell possessions, or borrow from neighbors, creating a ripple effect of economic stress that lasted well beyond the courtroom. This was punishment as slow drip rather than sharp lash, teaching endurance in the quiet, grinding sense. Publicly paying a fine could also bring shame. Sometimes, Offenders had to stand in front of the community while handing over coins, a moment that combined financial and social humiliation. It was a reminder that even if the whip was spared, the eyes of neighbors remained relentless judges. So, as you count your coins and weigh your options, remember that medieval justice often taught patience not through pain, but through prolonged economic hardship. A slow lesson in the value of every penny and the heavy price of survival. You stand, feeling the heavy gaze of the entire village pressing down on you. As the weight of public shaming settles in like a thick fog, public humiliation was the medieval community's social experiment in control, and patience was the currency required to endure it. You are not only punished by officials, but also by neighbors who judge, whisper, and exclude you. The slow drip of social rejection and communal judgment can be as punishing as any physical device, teaching that endurance of humiliation was a tool of conformity. Shaming punishments took many forms: wearing a sign describing your offense, parading through town, or sitting in the stocks or pillory. Exposed to ridicule, the goal was to mark offenders visibly and socially, not just legally. This communal aspect of justice relied heavily on the village's participation, turning punishment into a collective ritual of enforcement. Historians still debate how effective public shaming was in deterring crime or rehabilitating offenders. Some argue it strengthened community bonds by clearly defining acceptable behavior, while others suggest it led to ostracism that pushed offenders further from society rather than reintegrating them. The tension between inclusion and exclusion in medieval justice is a complex one, a quirky detail. In some places, offenders were made to wear shame caps or signs with embarrassing slogans, turning them into walking billboards for bad behavior. Imagine the slow grind of walking through the market with a sign proclaiming your crime. It's less immediate pain, more prolonged psychological torment. The psychology of public shaming involves the community acting as judge, jury, and executioner. Your patience is tested not in minutes or hours, but over days or weeks of whispered gossip, cold shoulders, and averted eyes. This slow social punishment could crush spirits more effectively than a quick lash or brief stint in the stocks. Social reintegration was difficult after such punishments. Some communities allowed offenders to regain their place by demonstrating good behavior, while others condemned them to permanent outsider status. This ambivalence made patience a lifelong challenge, as forgiveness wasn't guaranteed, and social survival required careful navigation. So, as you feel the crowd's eyes pierce through your skin and their whispers cut deeper than knives, remember that medieval justice often relied on the slow, relentless power of communal judgment to teach patience and enforce order. You stand near the flickering flames, the heat licking your skin, your breath catching as smoke curls into the night sky. Fire was one of medieval Europe's most terrifying instruments of punishment, used for heretics, witches, and the most reviled criminals. This was justice turned spectacle flames, not only destroyed, but purified, embodying fear and endurance in a harsh, roaring trial. The slow burn wasn't just physical agony, it was a test of mental endurance as well, demanding patience in the face of inevitable horror. Burning at the stake was often reserved for those accused of crimes against the church or state, particularly heresy or witchcraft, reflecting the intertwining of religion and justice in medieval society. The spectacle was public and final, designed to warn others of the consequences of disobedience or dissent. The crowd gathered not just to witness punishment, but to participate in the ritual affirmation of communal values. Historians still argue about the actual experience of those condemned to burn. Did some suffer quick death from smoke inhalation, or was the process deliberately prolonged to maximize agony? The debate extends to whether the spectacle's psychological terror was as effective as the physical punishment in enforcing conformity. A quirky fact: in some executions, executioners tried to speed death by strangling or poisoning the victim before lighting the fire, a grim mercy that varied widely. Victims were tied tightly to prevent struggle, ensuring the crowd's view remained uninterrupted, a macabre form of audience management. The slow unfolding of fire's destruction tested patience on multiple levels. The victim's endurance of pain, the crowd's attention span, and the societal willingness to embrace such brutal public spectacles. Fire symbolized both destruction and purification, a fiery crucible where justice was forged through endurance and fear. The psychological impact extended beyond the victim. Watching someone burn was intended to sear fear into the hearts of the living, reinforcing obedience through collective trauma. This communal participation made the slow death by fire not only a punishment, but a ritual of social cohesion and control. So, as the flames rise and the heat intensifies, remember that fire was the ultimate medieval lesson in patience endurance through slow, blazing agony witnessed by an entire community bound by fear and belief. You sit alone in a dark, damp cell, the cold stone pressing against your back, the silence stretching endlessly around you. Imprisonment in medieval Europe wasn't just about confinement. It was a slow, grinding test of mental endurance and patience. Unlike the brief, brutal punishments in public squares, being locked away meant facing isolation, uncertainty, and the oppressive weight of time with no clear end in sight. You're left with your thoughts, your fears, and the slow tick of endless days and nights. Prisons in the Middle Ages were often crude, uncomfortable places, dark, cold, and overcrowded. They were primarily used to hold people awaiting trial or punishment, rather than long-term incarceration, which was rare and harsh. Yet, those sentenced to imprisonment faced the slowest form of punishment, where waiting itself became a form of suffering. The absence of physical pain was replaced by psychological torment. Historians still argue about how imprisonment functioned in medieval justice. Was it a humane alternative to harsher corporal punishments, or merely a means of containment before execution or flogging? The lack of standardized prison conditions and sentences means experiences varied widely, complicating attempts to generalize. One curious fact: some prisoners were allowed limited freedoms, such as working in the local town or receiving visitors, which offered rare relief from monotony. Others faced solitary confinement in tiny cells with barely enough room to sit, emphasizing the slow torture of isolation. This patchwork of conditions shows how patience had to be tailored to the individual's circumstances. The mental challenges of imprisonment were immense. Without modern comforts or distractions, prisoners had to endure boredom, fear, and loneliness, sometimes for months or even years. This was patience in its most relentless form, waiting not just for punishment, but for an uncertain fate. The slow erosion of hope often matched or exceeded physical pain and difficulty. Imprisonment also carried social consequences. Prisoners risked losing their social standing, livelihoods, and families' support, extending punishment beyond bars. This ripple effect made patience a long-term challenge, as reintegration after release was difficult or impossible. So, as you sit in that cold, dark cell, remember, medieval imprisonment was a test of mental endurance, where patience wasn't about resisting pain, but about surviving time itself, the slowest and perhaps most cruel punishment of all. You lean back, the echoes of past punishments lingering in your mind like a fading nightmare. The brutal, bizarre, and often bewildering punishments of medieval Europe might seem like relics from a darker time, but their legacy hums quietly beneath the surface of modern justice systems. Patience, slow, grinding, and sometimes agonizing remains a central lesson, a thread connecting you to those who endured stocks, whippings, brandings, and cages centuries ago. Their suffering wasn't just about pain, it was about waiting, enduring, and, in some strange way, surviving the cruelty of their world. Medieval punishments reflected society's struggles with crime, order, and human nature. They taught patience not through quick justice, but through prolonged, public, and often humiliating experiences that forced offenders to confront themselves and their community. Even now, echoes of this endure in how justice balances punishment with patience, how society wrestles with retribution and rehabilitation. Historians still debate the efficacy and morality of these punishments. Were they effective deterrents or cruel spectacles that fed communal violence? Did they foster repentance or deepen social divides? These questions keep the medieval world relevant, reminding you that justice is as complex as the human condition itself. One quirky reminder: while you might never face a pillory or ducking stool, the medieval mindset's influence lingers in modern practices like community service or public apologies. Less brutal, but still rooted in public acknowledgement and endurance. Patience today might mean waiting in courtrooms or probation periods, rather than standing in stocks. But the essence remains. As you reflect on these strange and brutal lessons, you realize that patience was not just a virtue, but a survival skill forged in fire, wood, iron, and water. It's a slow, sometimes harsh teacher, but one that shaped societies and individuals alike. So, as you settle into the quiet night, remember these stories not as distant cruelties, but as echoes of endurance, resilience, and the human capacity to endure the slow lessons of justice. Now, let's gently ease out of this journey. The night deepens, and the harsh images of medieval punishments begin to soften, like a distant storm fading into a calm sea. Your breathing slows, the tension in your muscles unwinds, and the harsh clangs and jeers melt away. Patience, once a trial by fire and iron, now becomes a gentle whisper, a reminder that endurance can be quiet, that suffering can transform into strength. You are safe here, in this calm moment, where the shadows of the past gently dissolve. Let your mind drift, feeling the slow, comforting rhythm of your breath and the soft hum of the night. Each heartbeat is a reminder of resilience, a signal that you carry patience within you, not born of cruelty, but forged in quiet moments of endurance. The stories fade into silence, leaving only peace. Rest now, letting the gentle night embrace you. Tomorrow awaits, but for now, sleep deep and dream softly,